Hi, and welcome to Ginger English. I'm Sarah, and today we have a B1 level podcast for you. Today, I want to tell you a true story. It's a story about my grandmother. It's a story about a letter. And it's a story about 3 days that changed everything. I found this story in an old box. The box was in my grandmother's attic. Inside, there were letters, old yellow letters, and one of them was never opened. Why not? Because it arrived too late. 3 days too late. And those 3 days changed my grandmother's whole life. This is a story about love, but it's also a story about war, about mistakes, and about what happens when life doesn't go the way we plan. Are you ready? Let's start at the beginning. My grandmother's name was Eleanor. In 1943, she was 19 years old. She lived in a small town in Ohio. It was a quiet place. Everyone knew everyone. Life was simple, but the world outside was not simple at all. It was the middle of World War II. There was a young man in town. His name was Thomas. He was tall, with dark hair and a kind smile. Eleanor and Thomas grew up together. They went to the same school. They walked to church together every Sunday. And slowly, over the years, something changed between them. They fell in love. Thomas wanted to marry Eleanor. He asked her father for permission. Her father said yes. They planned a wedding for the spring of 1944. Everything was perfect. Eleanor was happy. She was so happy. But then, in early 1944, Thomas received a letter. It was from the army. He had to report for duty. He had to leave for the war. The letter said he had 2 weeks before he had to go. 2 weeks. That's all they had. Eleanor and Thomas talked every day during those 2 weeks. They walked along the river. They sat under the old oak tree near her house. They talked about their future. They talked about the house they would build, the children they would have, the life they would live together after the war. On the last night before Thomas had to leave, he gave Eleanor a small ring. It wasn't expensive. It was simple, just a thin gold band. But to Eleanor, it meant everything. "When I come back," Thomas said, "we'll get married properly, I promise." The next morning, Thomas left on a train. Eleanor stood at the station crying. She watched the train until it disappeared. And then she went home and waited. For a few months, letters came regularly. Thomas wrote about training, about other soldiers, about how much he missed home. Eleanor wrote back every single time. She told him about the town, about her family, about how she counted the days until he would return. But then, in the summer of 1944, the letters became less frequent. Days turned into weeks without any word. Eleanor began to worry. Was Thomas okay? Was he safe? She didn't know. Nobody knew. And then, one day, a letter finally arrived. But it wasn't from Thomas. It was from his commanding officer. The letter said that Thomas's unit had been in heavy fighting. Many soldiers were missing. Thomas was one of them. Missing, not dead, not confirmed alive, just missing. Eleanor read that letter again and again. For weeks, she waited for more news. Any news? But nothing came. The silence was the hardest part. Weeks turned into months. Eleanor's family tried to comfort her, but how do you comfort someone whose future has just disappeared? Eleanor stopped going to town. She spent most of her days sitting by the window, watching the road, hoping to see Thomas walking toward the house. But Thomas never came. By the end of 1944, Eleanor's father became very worried about her. "You can't live like this," he told her one evening. "You're young. Thomas would want you to be happy, not to wait forever." Eleanor knew her father was right, but it didn't make things easier. How could she move on? Around that time, a man named Robert moved to town. He worked at the local bank. Robert was kind, polite, and a bit shy. He had also lost someone in the war, his younger brother. So, in a strange way, Robert understood Eleanor's pain better than anyone else. Robert and Eleanor started talking. At first, it was small conversations at church or at the market, but slowly they became friends. Robert never tried to rush things. He never asked Eleanor to forget Thomas. He simply was there. He listened. He understood. Months passed. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Soldiers started coming home. Eleanor watched as families reunited, as mothers hugged their sons. Every time a soldier returned to town, Eleanor's heart would jump. Maybe this time it's Thomas. Maybe he's alive after all. But it never was. By the end of 1945, almost all the soldiers had returned, except Thomas. The army said his case was still under investigation. But that phrase started to feel like a polite way of saying we don't know. And we probably never will. Eleanor's father spoke to her again, this time more directly. Eleanor, it's been almost 2 years. You need to think about your future. Robert cares about you. Don't let your whole life pass by because of maybe. Eleanor thought about it for a long time. She thought about the ring Thomas had given her, the simple gold band she still wore on a chain around her neck, and she thought about the empty years ahead of her if she kept waiting for someone who might never return. In early 1946, Robert asked Eleanor to marry him. It wasn't an easy decision. Eleanor cried for days before she gave him an answer. Part of her felt like she was betraying Thomas, but another part of her knew that she couldn't keep living in the past forever. Robert was kind, Robert was real, Robert was here. Finally, Eleanor said yes. The wedding was small and simple, held at the same church where Eleanor and Thomas used to go every Sunday. Eleanor wore her mother's old dress. Robert looked nervous but happy, and Eleanor smiled, but it was a complicated smile. Happy, but also a little sad. After the wedding, Eleanor and Robert moved to a house just outside of town. Robert worked at the bank. Eleanor took care of the house, and a few years later, their children, a boy and a girl. Eleanor loved her children deeply, and over time, she grew to love Robert too. Maybe not the same way she had loved Thomas, but in her own way. Quieter, calmer, more grown up. She kept Thomas's ring hidden in a small box at the bottom of her dresser drawer, along with a few old letters and photographs. Now, let's jump forward. Almost 30 years passed. It's 1973. Eleanor is in her late 40s now. Her children are grown up, her son is in college, and her daughter just got married. Robert is still working at the bank. Life is calm and predictable. One Saturday morning, Eleanor went to the local farmer's market, like she did every weekend. She was buying vegetables, tomatoes, and fresh corn. The market was busy and full of people. And then Eleanor heard a voice. It was a man's voice talking to a vendor a few stalls away. Something about that voice made Eleanor freeze. She couldn't move. She couldn't even breathe properly. That voice, it was familiar. Too familiar. It sounded like, no, it couldn't be. It was impossible. Eleanor turned around slowly, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a man. An older man now, with gray hair and lines on his face that hadn't been there 30 years ago, but his eyes were the same. And his smile, when he turned and saw her, his smile was exactly the same as it had been all those years ago. It was Thomas. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them said anything. The market noise around them seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them, standing there, staring at each other, 30 years older, 30 years apart, but somehow still recognizing each other instantly. Eleanor, Thomas said finally, his voice was shaking. Thomas, Eleanor whispered. She felt like she might faint. This isn't real. This can't be real. He's supposed to be... You're alive, Eleanor said. It wasn't really a question. It was more like she was trying to convince herself that what she was seeing was real. I'm alive, Thomas said quietly. I've been alive this whole time, Eleanor. Eleanor's mind was racing. 30 years? 30 years? And Thomas had been alive this whole time? But how? Why didn't he come back? Why didn't he write? Why did everyone think he was missing? Possibly dead. I don't understand, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. What happened to you? Thomas looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes, pain maybe, or regret, or both. It's a long story, he said. Can we talk somewhere? Not here. Somewhere quieter? Eleanor hesitated. She thought about Robert. She thought about her children. She thought about her whole life, the life she had built, the life that was now standing in front of her, completely upside down. But she also thought about the 30 years of wondering, the 30 years of not knowing, the 30 years of carrying a small gold ring in a drawer, a piece of a story that never had an ending. Okay, Eleanor said finally. There's a coffee shop nearby. We can talk there. They walked together to a small cafe a few blocks away. Neither of them spoke during the walk. The silence was heavy, full of 30 years of questions neither of them knew how to ask. When they sat down, Thomas ordered 2 coffees without even asking what Eleanor wanted. He remembered. He remembered that she took her coffee with just a little bit of cream, no sugar. That small detail almost made Eleanor cry. Thomas took a deep breath. Eleanor, I need to tell you something I've been carrying for 30 years. Eleanor nodded slowly. Go on. In 1944, my unit was sent into a battle in France. It was chaos, bombs everywhere, smoke, gunfire. I got separated from my unit. I was hit, shrapnel in my leg and shoulder. I fell into a ditch and I thought I was going to die there. Eleanor's hand covered her mouth. Oh, Thomas. A French family found me, an old farmer and his wife. They pulled me out of that ditch, hid me in their barn, and took care of me. For weeks, I was barely conscious. They thought I might not survive. But slowly, I got better. Why didn't you write to me? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. I tried, Thomas said, but we were in occupied territory. The Germans were still around. Any letter could have gotten the family killed for hiding an American soldier. I couldn't risk it. Eleanor was quiet. Okay, but the war ended in 1945. Why didn't you come back then? This was the part Thomas had been dreading. By the time the area was liberated, it was late 1945. I was different, Eleanor. The things I'd seen, I wasn't the same person who left home. I had nightmares. I couldn't sleep. I'd hear a loud noise and I'd hit the ground, shaking, like I was back in that battlefield. That's normal, Thomas. Soldiers who came back, they all struggled with that. I know, but I was ashamed. I thought if I came home like that, broken, jumpy, having nightmares, you'd see me differently. You'd pity me, and I couldn't bear that. I wanted to come home as the man who left, strong, whole, not this. So instead, you stayed away? Eleanor's voice had an edge now. I told myself it was temporary. I got a job in France, working construction, helping rebuild towns that had been destroyed. The work helped me. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years, Eleanor said quietly. Yes, and the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to come back. I kept thinking, what if she's moved on? I was scared of the answer. So I stayed. I built a life there. Eventually, I got married to a French woman named Marie. We had children. Eleanor felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, even a little anger. You had a whole life. While you waited, Thomas finished softly. I know. I'm sorry. I should have written. That would have given you closure. Instead, I let you keep waiting for nothing. So, why are you back now? In Ohio? Marie passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. After she died, I felt lost again. My children are grown with their own lives in France. I came back to settle family matters, sell the old property. I never expected to run into you. I swear, I never planned this. Eleanor sat back, processing everything. 30 years of assumptions, of grief, of moving on. All of it suddenly had a different shape now. I don't know what to feel, Thomas. I'm happy you're alive, but I'm also angry. Sad. It's complicated. I understand, Thomas said. I just needed you to know the truth. There was a long silence. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small chain. On it was a thin gold ring, the same ring Thomas had given her 30 years ago. Thomas's eyes widened. You kept it, he said softly. I never told anyone, Eleanor admitted. Not Robert. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting, and a little messy too. After that conversation in the cafe, Eleanor and Thomas talked for almost 2 hours. They talked about everything: the years they'd missed, the children they'd raised, the lives they'd built without each other. By the time Eleanor got home, the sun was setting, and she felt completely drained, emotionally exhausted in a way she hadn't felt in years. Robert was in the kitchen when she walked in. Where were you? I was starting to worry. Eleanor froze for a second. Should I tell him? Her mind raced. 30 years of marriage, 2 children, a whole life built with Robert, and now this. How do you explain something like this to your husband? I ran into someone, Eleanor said carefully. Someone from a long time ago. Robert looked up from the stove. Oh, anyone I know? Eleanor took a deep breath. Robert, it was Thomas. For a moment, Robert just stood there, completely still. He knew exactly who Thomas was. Everyone in town knew the story. The young soldier who went missing in the war, the fiancé he left behind. It was practically a local legend, even 30 years later. Thomas, Robert repeated slowly. The Thomas? Yes. He's alive? Yes. He's been alive this whole time. He's been living in France. He just came back to settle some family matters. Robert sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Eleanor sat across from him, watching his face, trying to read his reaction. Was he angry? Hurt? Confused? Finally, Robert spoke. How do you feel about this? It was such a simple question, but it carried so much weight. Eleanor thought carefully before answering. I don't know, Robert. I'm happy he's alive. I'm relieved that he wasn't, but I'm also confused. And maybe a little angry that he stayed away for so long without telling anyone. Robert nodded slowly. Did he explain why? Yes. PTSD, basically. Though they didn't call it that back then. He was ashamed. He thought coming home broken would make me see him differently. So he stayed in France, built a new life, got married, had kids. And now his wife has passed away, Robert said. It wasn't a question. He had already guessed where this was going. Yes. There was another silence. Then Robert asked the question that Eleanor had been dreading. Eleanor, do you still have feelings for him? Eleanor's heart skipped. She hadn't expected him to ask so directly, but Robert had always been like that. Straightforward, honest, never one to avoid difficult conversations. I don't know, Eleanor said honestly. I think part of me always wondered, always carried a little piece of that story, even after all these years. But Robert, I love you. I built my life with you. You're my husband, the father of my children. That's real. Robert reached across the table and took her hand. I know you love me, Eleanor. I've never doubted that. But I also know that first loves, they leave a mark. Especially one like this. One that ended so suddenly, with no closure, no goodbye. That's not something that just disappears because 30 years pass. Eleanor squeezed his hand. Thank you for understanding. I'm not worried about losing you, but I do think you need to process this. Maybe talk to Thomas again, get whatever closure you both need. Just be honest with me. That's all I ask. A few days later, Eleanor reached out to Thomas. They agreed to meet again, this time at the old oak tree near Eleanor's childhood home. The same tree where they used to sit together 30 years ago, back when they were young and full of plans. The tree was still there, older now, its branches wider, its trunk thicker, but it was still recognizable, still their tree. Eleanor arrived first. She sat on the same old bench beneath the tree, looking out at the field where she and Thomas used to walk. So many memories, so much had happened in this very spot. When Thomas arrived, he sat down beside her, but not too close. There was a respectful distance between them now, the distance of two people who had once been everything to each other, but who now belonged to different lives. I told Robert, Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her, surprised. You told him about me? Yes. He took it better than I expected, honestly. He said I needed to process this, to get closure. Thomas nodded slowly. He sounds like a good man. He is, Eleanor said simply. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the wind move through the tall grass in the field. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said finally. Of course. All those years, did you ever think about coming back? Even for a moment? Even just to see if I was okay? Thomas was quiet for a long time before answering. Every single day, Eleanor, especially in the beginning. I'd think about writing a letter just to tell you I was alive. I even started writing one once. I got about halfway through, and then I stopped. I was scared. Scared of what I'd find out. Scared that you'd already moved on and that finding out you had, it would somehow make everything worse. So I tore up the letter and never tried again. Eleanor felt a strange ache in her chest. There was a letter? You actually started writing one? Yes, it was around 1947, I think, 2 years after the war ended. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, thinking. 1947. She had already married Robert by then. The wedding had been in early 1946. If Thomas had sent that letter, if I had known he was alive in 1947, what would I have done? It was a question with no answer. A question that could never really be answered because the letter was never sent. It existed only as a half-written piece of paper that Thomas had torn up and thrown away 30 years ago. I think, Eleanor said slowly, I think there's a strange kind of peace in knowing that, Thomas, because it means even if you had sent that letter, I was already moving forward. I was already building a life. Maybe it would have changed things. Maybe it wouldn't have. But either way, I don't think either of us did anything wrong. We were just two people, trying to survive, trying to heal, trying to move forward in the only ways we knew how. Thomas looked at her, something like relief crossing his face. You're not angry with me? I was a little at first, but sitting here now, talking to you, I think I understand. You were dealing with something terrible, something I can't even imagine. And you made the choices that felt right to you at the time. I can't fault you for that. None of us can know what we would have done in someone else's shoes. Thank you, Thomas said quietly. That means more than you know. What now, though? Eleanor asked. What happens after today? Thomas thought about Eleanor's question for a long moment before answering. I think this is goodbye, Eleanor. A real one this time. The kind we never got 30 years ago. Eleanor felt tears forming in her eyes, but she nodded. I think you're right. I'm going to finish settling things here. Sell my parents' house, take care of some paperwork, and then I'll go back to France. My life is there now. My children, my grandchildren. That's where I belong. And my life is here, Eleanor said, with Robert, with my children, my grandchildren. Exactly, Thomas said softly. We both built good lives, Eleanor. Different lives than we imagined 30 years ago, but good ones. I think that's something to be grateful for, not something to mourn. Eleanor reached up and unclasped the chain around her neck, the chain with Thomas's ring on it. She held it in her palm for a moment, looking at the small gold band that had meant so much to her for so many years. I think it's time I let this go, she said. She held it out to Thomas. I want you to have it back. Not because I don't care about what we had, but because I think it belongs with you now. A piece of the past going back to where it started. Thomas looked at the ring, then at Eleanor. His eyes were glistening. Are you sure? Yes, Eleanor said. I've held on to this for 30 years, Thomas. It's time. I have my own life now, a full one. I don't need to carry this anymore. Thomas took the ring gently from her hand. He held it for a moment, and then, surprisingly, he smiled. You know what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to give it to my granddaughter. She's getting married next year. I'll tell her the story, not the sad parts, but the good parts. The parts about two young people who loved each other, who made promises under an oak tree, who survived a war and built lives, even apart. I think that's a story worth passing on. Eleanor smiled through her tears. I'd like that. They sat together for a while longer, not saying much, just enjoying the quiet, the breeze, the late afternoon sun filtering through the leaves of the old oak tree. Two people who had once shared everything, now sharing one final peaceful moment before going their separate ways. Finally, Thomas stood up. I should go. I have a flight to catch in a few days. Lots to wrap up before then. Eleanor stood too. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Thomas opened his arms and Eleanor stepped into them. They hugged, a long, warm hug, full of 30 years of unsaid things, finally being said in the simplest way possible. Take care of yourself, Eleanor, Thomas said quietly. I'm glad I got to see you again. Truly. Take care of yourself too, Thomas. I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad you're happy. And with that, Thomas walked away, down the path, through the field, the same path he had walked 30 years ago when he left for war. Except this time, there was no uncertainty, no fear, no waiting. Just two people walking forward into the rest of their lives, finally at peace with the past. Eleanor stood under the oak tree for a long time after Thomas left, watching the sun set over the field. She felt lighter somehow, like a weight she'd been carrying for 30 years had finally been set down. So, that's the story I found in my grandmother's old letters and photographs. Eleanor lived a long, happy life with Robert. They were married for over 50 years until Robert passed away in the early 2000s. Eleanor herself lived until she was 93, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. I never got to ask her about Thomas directly. She passed away before I found those old letters and photographs in her attic. But from what I pieced together, Thomas did go back to France, just like he said he would. And years later, I actually found a small newspaper clipping in that same box, an announcement of a wedding in France, mentioning a beautiful antique gold ring that had quite a story behind it, passed down through the family. I like to think that ring found its way to Thomas's granddaughter, just like he promised. And I like to think that somewhere in a small town in France, there's a family with a story about an American soldier, a young woman named Eleanor, and a promise made under an oak tree. A story that's been passed down generation to generation, just a little differently than the one I'm telling you today. What strikes me most about this story isn't the dramatic reunion, or the secrets, or even the 30-year gap. It's how ordinary both Eleanor and Thomas's choices were, in a way. They were both just people, doing their best with the information and circumstances they had. Neither of them was a villain. Neither of them did anything wrong exactly. They were just human. Flawed, scared, hopeful humans trying to navigate impossible situations as best they could. And honestly, I think that's what makes this story so powerful. It's not a fairy tale where everything works out perfectly. It's real, messy, complicated, bittersweet, but real. And in the end, both Eleanor and Thomas found peace. They found closure. And maybe that's the best any of us can hope for. So, what do you think? Would you have done what Eleanor did, married someone else after years of waiting? Or would you have continued to wait, hoping against hope? And if you were Thomas, would you have come home even broken? Or would you have stayed away, ashamed the way he did? There's no right answer here, just different choices, different paths, different lives. If you enjoyed this story, if it made you feel something, whether that's sadness, hope, or just curiosity about the people in your own family's history, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got so many more stories like this coming up, stories about love, loss, war, and the incredible, complicated ways people navigate their lives. And hey, if you're learning English with us today, I hope this episode helped you practice listening to natural conversational English, the kind people actually use every day. If you enjoyed the format, give this video a like and let us know in the comments. Do you have an old family story like this one? Something you found in an attic or heard from a grandparent that completely surprised you? Thanks so much for listening today. This has been Ginger English, and I'm Sarah. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep learning. Bye for now.